Hey guys, tonight we begin with the world behind the veil, the life of an Ottoman harem concubine. Often reduced to rumour or fantasy, the reality was far more layered, one of power, politics, beauty, and brutal competition, all housed within the gilded walls of the imperial palace. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You've just woken up in the Topkapi Palace harem. The good news? You're surrounded by silk, satin, and scented rosewater. The bad news? You are also surrounded by 200 other concubines, all of whom may or may not want to outshine you, out-scheme you, or in some cases, outlive you. You blink awake on a cushioned divan that looks like it was hand-stitched by blind angels using golden thread, because it probably was. You'd think this would feel luxurious. It doesn't. It feels like pressure. Constant, velvety pressure. A bell rings. Not for prayer, but for grooming. You have exactly 10 minutes to prepare your face to look naturally flawless, which is Ottoman for paint it like a Renaissance oil painting and smile like you enjoy it. There's rose oil for the skin, crushed pearls for your cheeks, and enough kohl eyeliner to write a love letter across your eyelids. Mascara? Invented by disappointment and applied with a twig. Privacy? Never heard of her. You share your chamber with women who may love you like sisters or plot your downfall like middle management villains. Gossip travels faster than letters. Alliances form over pomegranate seeds. Betrayals begin with a hairpin left in the wrong place. And the scent? Imagine a jasmine-scented fog bank mixed with anxiety, incense, and the eternal hope of catching the Sultan's eye. If Chanel ever released a perfume called Ambition and Claustrophobia, this would be it. You rise, smooth your embroidered caftan, hand-washed by a servant girl who's 12 but somehow already hates you, and head toward morning roll call, where senior eunuchs decide which concubines get summoned to the Sultan's attention. It's like a beauty pageant, except the prize is existential terror. No, you can't leave. Yes, someone is always watching. And your survival hinges on remaining fascinating, fragrant and fertile. Welcome to your day in the Ottoman Imperial Harem, where your first waking breath is a power play, your smile is strategy, and your bed is softer than freedom. And it only gets weirder from here. Welcome to the hammam, the steam-filled spa where imperial politics happen naked. You might assume the bathhouse is for hygiene, and technically you'd be right. But here in the harem, it's also where alliances form, rivalries simmer, along with your pores, and everything smells faintly of lavender, lemons, and passive aggression. The concubines file in like graceful ghosts wrapped in embroidered silk towels. You do the same, pretending this isn't the most intimidating nudity you've ever experienced. The senior women float through the marble chamber like swans, dangerous, territorial swans with better skin than you'll ever have. Attendants scrub you down with what feels like love, but is actually a loofah soaked in vengeance. Your skin tingles. Your dignity retreats. You try not to make eye contact while being exfoliated within an inch of your past life. You learn quickly. The bath is more than a bath. It's a surveillance chamber in disguise. Everyone's watching, not openly, but subtly. Who is sitting with whom? Who's whispering? Who's laughing a little too hard at the Valid Sultan's niece's joke? You don't speak much, because you're new. Speaking too soon in the hammam is like trying to open a chess match by flipping the board. The veterans will either ignore you or quietly decide you need correcting, usually in the form of chore reassignment or social exile. That being said, the hammam is your first glimpse of the harem's soft power. You hear tales, always half-whispered, of women who rose not just by catching the Sultan's eye, but by knowing the right bath attendant, the right older concubine, the right story to share at the right steamy moment. It's also the only place in the palace where secrets accidentally fall out, usually between splashes of water and scented soaps. You learn which concubines are favoured, which ones haven't been summoned in months, which eunuch allegedly dropped a love note. Scandalous. All this, overheard while someone is scrubbing your elbows like they're angry at them. You leave the hammam pink, polished, and 12% more paranoid than when you entered. Congratulations, your skin is radiant. Your mind? Permanently fogged by heat, jasmine, and the politics of proximity. If you thought the harem was all silk pillows and flutes playing in the distance, adorable. Really. But by now you've learned it's less of a day spa and more of a slow-motion chess match where the pieces are beautiful, bored, and dangerously well-informed. And then there are the eunuchs. Specifically the black eunuchs, high-ranking castrated guards who report directly to the valid sultan. They control who goes in and out of the harem, who gets summoned, who gets ignored, and occasionally who disappears without a trace and is never spoken of again. They don't smile much. They don't need to. Their presence alone is a career-ending gesture. You quickly learn, if you want to survive, better yet thrive, you don't flatter the sultan. You befriend the eunuchs. Not with gifts, that's suspicious. Not with flirting, deeply awkward and wildly inappropriate. No, the trick is to be respectful, predictable, and above all, inoffensively useful. You ask for nothing. You're always ready when summoned. You never ever gossip about them, because news travels in this palace faster than the plague, and you really don't want your name attached to a sentence that ends in... And then she was transferred to the laundry chamber. Meanwhile, among the concubines, relationships are complicated. You've made one tentative friend, a girl from Circassia, who pretends to like embroidery, but is clearly plotting something long-term and ruthless. You also have an enemy, though you're not sure why. She stared at you too long during lute practice. You blinked. She hasn't spoken to you since. Everything is subtle. Compliments are weapons. Smiles are loaded. You begin to miss the emotional simplicity of your old village goat. But you learn. You learn how to interpret silence. How to stand just close enough to power without looking ambitious. How to thank a eunuch for handing you a letter as if he just handed you a divine scroll. And most of all, you learn that survival here isn't about being the prettiest or the most talented. It's about understanding how power moves, in glances, in silence, in the way someone's name is spoken one day and not the next. At first glance, your job as a concubine seems simple. Look beautiful, smile politely, and waft through the palace like an emotionally available ghost in silk slippers. But in reality, you're now expected to master the oldest imperial skill of them all, absorbing everything while appearing to absorb nothing. You are a sponge. A bejeweled, perfumed sponge who embroiders a suspicious number of tulips while memorizing who sits where, who glares at whom, and who got an extra apricot at breakfast. Subtle changes in fruit distribution. In this palace, it's practically a coup. Your daily schedule now includes hours of training that sounds like finishing school but smells like political grooming. You're taught music, literature, poetry, Islamic law, Ottoman etiquette, and, if you're lucky, how not to pass out during dance lessons. The idea is to be beautiful, yes, but also charmingly clever without being threatening, like a decorative peacock that can quote Rumi and doesn't talk back. The real education, though, happens in between. You learn to notice how long it takes the Valid Sultan's tray to be cleared, and who clears it. You note which eunuch walks in just before bad news arrives. You memorize who's absent. You never ask why. You listen more than you speak. Actually, you don't speak unless someone 3 ranks above you asks you to. Even then, you keep it brief. Ideally with a comment that's humble, insightful, and somehow flattering to them without sounding like you're trying. And while you sit there with your hands neatly folded over your embroidery, which may or may not be a misshapen dove, you are quietly archiving every interaction in your mental scroll, alliances, slights, opportunities, names. especially names. You also begin to understand the unspoken ranking system. Who is favoured, who is tolerated, who is 3 skipped meals away from being reassigned to kitchen duty. You are currently somewhere between interesting newcomer and acceptable wall furnishing. Don't worry, that's better than it sounds. Because the truth is, in the Ottoman harem, looking harmless is one of the most dangerous things you can do, and you're starting to do it quite well. There are 2 kinds of fear in the harem: the fear of being overlooked and the fear of being noticed. Today, you are flirting dangerously with the second. It begins innocently. You are handed a new robe, not the usual subtle grey-blue cotton you've worn for weeks, but something far too bold. Silk, rose-coloured, embroidered with tiny golden vines. You stare at it like it just proposed to you. "From the Valid Sultan's steward," the servant girl mutters, eyes down. This could mean anything. Maybe you're being rewarded. Maybe you're being tested. Maybe it was meant for another concubine, and you're now walking into someone else's assassination plot with very soft sleeves. You put it on. It fits suspiciously well. As you pass through the harem corridors, the other women notice. Not openly, that would be beneath them, but with precisely timed pauses in conversation, raised brows, and one glance so sharp it could cut embroidery thread. You sit for morning recitation with your posture a little straighter. You pretend not to notice that you've been placed slightly closer to the front. Not directly next to the favoured ones, but not with the wallpaper girls either. Then there's the rose. Later that afternoon, a eunuch delivers a single pink rose to your quarters. Just one. No message, no explanation. You hold it like it might detonate. In palace code, this could mean anything. The Sultan might have noticed you. Or someone wants it to look that way. Or maybe you're being set up for palace gossip. The deadliest game of telephone in Ottoman history. The safest move. You press the rose between the pages of your prayer book and tell absolutely no one. Not even your shadow. Especially not your shadow. She gossips. You go to bed that night draped in rose silk, feeling like a target inside a Valentine's Day card. Here in the harem, rising too quickly is suspicious. Standing out is dangerous. But disappearing, that's worse. So you hold your posture, sip your sherbet, and prepare for whatever this robe and rose combination means, because it might be everything, or it might be nothing. And in this place, both are equally terrifying. Dinner in the harem isn't dinner. It's theatre. Competitive, highly seasoned theatre, where everyone wears silk and pretends they're not sizing up their enemies between bites of stewed lamb. You enter the great dining chamber and take your seat, not too close to the centre, you haven't earned that, and not too far in the shadows, you're not invisible yet. The seating arrangement is an ever-shifting map of status. One week you're near the lute player who knows everyone's secrets. The next, you're next to a woman who hasn't spoken since 1572. The food arrives on trays carried by silent eunuchs. Bowls of saffron rice, pomegranate-studded pilaf, grape leaves, sweet sherbets in crystal glasses, all of it delicate, flavourful, and somehow emotionally threatening. No one rushes. That would be vulgar. You nibble slowly, gracefully, like someone who doesn't even really need food because she is nourished by poetry and intrigue alone. Conversations are hushed. Nobody laughs too loud unless they're trying to send a message. I'm confident enough to be cheerful in this snake pit. You nod politely. You smile just enough. You do not, under any circumstance, ask for more bread. Hunger is weakness. So is gluttony. Also, someone might be watching to see if you take 2 figs. You catch eyes with another concubine across the table. She's new. Or maybe she's old and reborn with a better tailor. Either way, her earrings are too large for her rank, and her smile is the kind that comes with long-term plans. You break eye contact before she decides you're a problem. Then comes the part no one ever admits, watching the eunuch enter. When he steps in, the air shifts. If he heads your way, a letter, an invitation, anything, you remain perfectly calm on the outside. Internally, your soul may or may not be breakdancing. If he doesn't, you nod as if this suits you just fine. You didn't want to be summoned anyway. You're busy, chewing suspiciously decorative grapes. By the end of dinner, nothing has happened. And everything has happened. Power has changed hands in eyebrow lifts and polite laughter. You rise, you bow, you leave. Still hungry, still smiling, still in the game. You try to sleep, which is adorable, because the harem at night is like a theatre stage after the performance, dim, hushed, but still full of tension. The lanterns flicker low, the fountains murmur outside, and you lie awake wondering if tonight is the night a eunuch knocks on your door. You know the rules. The Sultan chooses in secret, sometimes with intent, sometimes impulsively, sometimes because he saw a girl drop a fig with particular elegance. There is no pattern, no logic, just anticipation and silk-robed anxiety. Around you, the other women pretend to sleep. One breathes too loudly. Another keeps adjusting her veil like it might protect her from bad news or good luck. Everyone's pretending not to care. You care. Of course you care. You were handed a rose 2 days ago, and you're still trying to decide if it was a compliment or a warning. Maybe both. Maybe neither. Palace communication is like poetry written by a committee of spies. Suddenly, soft footsteps. A door creaks. Somewhere, a eunuch whispers a name. Not yours. You exhale. Relief. Disappointment. A cocktail of both served in an emotional silver goblet. You roll over and close your eyes, only for your mind to start staging imaginary conversations with the Sultan, in 3 different languages, all of which you're still learning. You dream. But not of home. That place is blurry now. You dream of the woman across the dining table with the earrings too large for her rank. She smiles at you in the dream. You wake up certain she wants you demoted, exiled, or at the very least stuck in lute lessons for the rest of your natural life. You dab rose water under your nose and pretend it's calming. It isn't. But it smells like control. At some point, just before dawn, you finally drift off. You've survived another night without being chosen, without being erased, without accidentally looking too eager or too dull. And in the palace of Topkapi, that's not sleep, that's a diplomatic victory. There are 2 stories whispered in the harem. One is the fairy tale, where the Sultan notices you, and your life is transformed by luxury, influence, and the occasional diamond the size of a walnut. The other is what actually happens. The Sultan, ruler of an empire that stretches from Hungary to Arabia, may or may not remember your name. You are one of hundreds. He could have summoned you because you look like a painting he once saw, or because his coffee tasted a bit too bitter and he's in the mood for distraction. When the eunuch knocks on your door after nightfall, he doesn't explain. He just bows. You rise, silently, heart pounding in your ears like a royal drumline. You are led through halls lit by lanterns and scented with sandalwood. A path hundreds have walked, but only a few have returned from with stories worth surviving. You arrive at a chamber where your reflection stares back from polished brass and tile mosaics. A final attendant adjusts your veil, adds 1 more drop of oil behind your ears, and gives you a look that says, "Smile, but not too much. Speak, but only if spoken to. And for the love of Allah, don't trip." You enter, and there he is, the Sultan, the man you've trained for, feared, imagined, and maybe accidentally dreamed about during Quran lessons. He is wearing silk robes and an unreadable expression. He says your name, the new one, not the one your mother gave you. He asks where you're from. You lie gracefully. You talk about poetry. He nods. Then he hands you a fig. What does it mean? Everything in the harem is a metaphor, and this fruit is no different. Is it a test of refinement? An invitation? A subtle indication of dietary preference? You take the fig, peel it gently, and offer a reply that sounds both elegant and mysterious. Something about sweet things hiding bitterness. You hope it sounds deep. It might just sound hungry. The night passes in conversation, music, and the occasional silence that feels like a judgment. When you are dismissed, it's with a nod. You are escorted back, alone, intact, and thoroughly bewildered. You have been noticed. And now, things are about to get complicated. You return just before dawn, walking softer than usual, as if stepping too loudly might break whatever spell you were briefly under. You slept, sort of. More accurately, you reclined next to the most powerful man in the empire and tried very hard not to sweat through your perfume. You were charming, you think. You definitely said something about poetry. Or maybe goats. You're not sure anymore. The eunuchs say nothing when you pass. That's good. Silence is always preferable to a knowing smirk. Back in the harem, the air smells different. Same jasmine incense, same rose oil in the hallway, but now it's seasoned with something new. Attention. The concubines don't look at you directly. That would be crass. But you feel their glances bounce off your shoulders like decorative daggers. At breakfast, your seating has changed, a little closer to the centre. Not too obvious, but enough to say, she might be relevant now. Your sherbet is slightly colder than everyone else's. It's the little luxuries that reveal everything. You're still you, still technically low in rank, still expected to attend lessons, still responsible for folding far too many embroidered towels. But now you're under surveillance. Not by the palace guards, by everyone else. Girls who never spoke to you before suddenly want to share their favourite verses from Persian poetry. A servant accidentally leaves a pomegranate on your tray, a fruit associated with fertility, which is about as subtle as dropping a baby cradle in your lap. Even your enemies become more polite. They nod slightly. Their eyes, however, remain sharp and amused, like cats watching a candle. The older concubines offer no expression at all. They've seen this before. Some of them were you, 5 years ago. 1 or 2 still might be. You spend the rest of the day doing what the harem trains you to do best, appearing neutral. You speak when addressed. You smile just enough. You move like you belong here, because now you sort of do. But the real trick? Not letting anyone know how you feel. Because in this palace, emotion is a currency, and yours is under heavy exchange. You've stepped onto the palace ladder now, the one no one talks about, but everyone's scrambling up in their softest slippers. It doesn't lean against a wall. It floats, shifts, and sometimes snaps in half under the weight of ambition. The first step, survive the attention. Your name, your new government-issued Ottoman name, is whispered more often now. Not loudly, of course, just enough that you begin to feel like a character in someone else's play. One day, you're complimented on your embroidery by a concubine who previously thought you were part of the furniture. The next, you're offered fig paste by someone who'd rather poison you than promote your breakfast. You decline. Politely. You've also been reassigned to a new chamber. It has 2 extra cushions, better lighting, and a mirror that doesn't distort your face into a medieval fresco. That's not generosity. That's a signal. You're rising. Slowly. Like steam in the hammam. Visible, fleeting, and occasionally scalding. And so begins the dangerous balancing act, known as strategic modesty. If you act too pleased, you're arrogant. If you act too humble, you're manipulative. If you trip on your robes and faceplant into the prayer mat, okay, that's just unfortunate, but they'll still talk about it. The Valide Sultan, the mother of the Sultan and CEO of all that glitters, starts to notice you. Not directly, of course, but her steward now nods at you in the hallway. That's basically an endorsement, or a warning, possibly both. Meanwhile, your peers begin dividing into categories: the friendly opportunists, the silent threats, and one terrifying girl who seems to live entirely on melon and revenge. You learn to navigate them all, with smiles that say, "I respect you," and eyes that whisper, "But I will absolutely outlive you." Pearls appear on your caftan one morning, small ones, at the collar, a gift, or a test, Or just pearls. You wear them carefully, like armor with excellent luster. Every gesture matters now. How you walk, how you bow, how long you hold someone's gaze. This isn't flirtation. This is diplomacy. In slippers, you're climbing, gently, carefully. And if you fall, the floor is paved with other girls who once had pearls too. There are moments in palace life that make your pulse trip over itself. Being summoned by the Sultan is one. Being noticed by the Valide Sultan, that's a different league entirely. She doesn't just run the harem. She is the harem. Architect of alliances, keeper of traditions. Benevolent grandmother one moment, political thunderstorm the next. And today, she looks at you. Not a passing glance. Not a polite acknowledgement. A full, direct, measured look. The kind of look that suggests she knows where you came from, where you're going, and how you chew your melon slices. You respond the only acceptable way. You panic. Internally. Externally, you bow with mechanical precision, lower your gaze just enough to show respect, but not subservience, and immediately begin questioning every outfit you've worn in the past month. Later, a steward arrives with a message. You are invited to assist with one of the Valide's charitable sewing projects. Translation: she wants to observe you in a room full of older, sharper women who can detect ambition at 500 paces. You arrive on time. Not too early. That's desperate. Not too late. That's suicidal. She sits surrounded by cushions, embroidery hoops, and the kind of silence that dares you to speak first. You don't. You thread a needle and pretend this doesn't feel like a job interview disguised as domestic servitude. The other women chat. Politely. The Valida listens. Occasionally, she asks a question. Where were you educated? What's your favourite surah? Have you ever met anyone who truly understands politics? You answer carefully, gracefully, as if your entire future depends on it. Because it does. At one point she smiles, not at you, near you, which is basically the same thing. When it's over, you bow again and exit with the calm of someone who has no idea whether they've just been promoted or marked for reassignment to towel duty. Back in your chamber, your roommate stares at you like you've just returned from riding a dragon. She looked at you, she whispers. You nod, smiling faintly. You don't say it aloud, but yes. And you're still sweating. There's a knock at your chamber door, not the gentle knock of a friend, or the impatient tap of a eunuch carrying towels. This one is deliberate, the kind of knock that comes with consequences. A message is handed to you. You are invited to a private tea by one of the Sultan's favoured consorts. Her name is whispered through the harem like a lullaby sung with a knife in it. She is powerful, poised, and, depending on who you ask, either your best chance at survival or the reason girls disappear mysteriously during lunch. You accept. Of course you do, because saying no in the harem is about as effective as throwing a fig at a cavalry charge. You dress with mathematical care. Not too extravagant. She might think you're challenging her. Not too plain. She might think you're insulting her. You settle on elegance with plausible humility and add a hairpin that says, I'm competent, but not plotting in yet. The tea room is small, perfumed, and intimidatingly silent. She sits alone, reclining like someone who invented reclining. Her robe is embroidered with threads that probably cost more than your hometown. She gestures for you to sit. You do, gracefully, quietly, with just enough bow to imply deference but not desperation. She pours the tea herself. That's either very generous or very symbolic. Possibly both. What follows is a masterclass in veiled threats and indirect compliments. She tells you she's heard you've caught the attention of some influential eyes. She says it like you've accidentally adopted a stray panther. She smiles when you respond. You do not know if she likes your answer or if she's marking you for later. You talk of poetry, music, and carefully palace routines. She nods often. Occasionally she glances at the door, as if calculating whether you're worth her time or just another chapter in her scrapbook of rising starlets. After the second cup, she dismisses you with a smile that could launch or sink a career. You return to your chamber exhausted and slightly unsure whether you've been recruited, warned, or subtly claimed. Either way, someone very important now knows your name, and that is both your greatest asset and your newest liability. By now, you've learned that words in the harem are like spices, used sparingly, and always with purpose. Say too much, and you're exposed. Say too little, and you're forgotten. But if you say just enough, and let silence do the rest, that's when you become dangerous. Today's lesson begins in the music chamber, where a group of senior concubines gathers to discuss poetry, philosophy, and, let's be honest, each other. You are invited to sit in, not speak, sit. A test disguised as hospitality. You arrive on time, offer the required courtesies, and fold yourself neatly into the corner like a well-mannered napkin. You sip your sherbet. You nod occasionally. You look interested, but not eager. You laugh softly at one joke, just enough to seem human. And then it happens. One of the elder women turns to you and asks a question. Not a trap. Not yet. Just a simple inquiry about your thoughts on a Rumi verse. But you know what this is. They're not testing your taste in poetry. They're testing your timing. You pause, long enough to seem thoughtful. Not so long that it looks like you're scrambling for a safe answer. Then you say something that sounds reflective, reverent, and, above all, vague. They nod. They are satisfied. You've passed. Later you are asked again, this time about the Valid Sultan's new charitable initiative. You say nothing critical. You compliment the elegance of the idea without claiming to understand the politics behind it. You use words like humbling and visionary. You are playing verbal chess with invisible queens. The truth is, most power in the harem is held in silence, in the glance that lingers, in the smile that doesn't quite reach the eyes, in the pause before someone replies, where everyone leans in, just slightly, to see which direction the wind is blowing. You leave that room, having said less than a dozen sentences. And somehow, your name is on 3 more lips than it was yesterday. You're not just surviving now. You're learning to glide, wordlessly, precisely, and beautifully, through a world where stillness speaks louder than declarations. And the walls, they're still listening. You find a gift on your pillow. No note, no signature. Just a small velvet box tied with a ribbon the colour of dried rose petals and possibly veiled judgment. You open it slowly, as one opens anything in the harem, halfway expecting perfume, halfway expecting scorpions. It's jewellery. A delicate bracelet inlaid with turquoise and gold filigree. Beautiful, elegant, alarming, because nothing here is ever just a gift. You scan the room. Your roommate raises an eyebrow. She does not ask questions. She's either very polite or very invested in plausible deniability. The bracelet is, undoubtedly, expensive. Too expensive for a casual trinket. Not quite royal enough to be from the Sultan. Which narrows it down to someone wealthy, calculating, and interested in controlling the narrative. Or you. You wear it. Of course you do. That's the game. By mid-morning, the rumours begin. She received a gift, someone whispers at the fountain. From whom? Someone else replies. She didn't say, comes the answer, which in this place is the same as saying everyone should assume the worst or most interesting option. You maintain your expression, a calm mix of modesty, confusion, and mild boredom. Meanwhile, your internal monologue is doing cartwheels through every past conversation, searching for enemies, allies, and anyone with a taste for turquoise. By lunchtime, the gossip has mutated. You've allegedly received a secret message, a hidden proposal, and an heirloom passed down from the Valid Sultan herself. All untrue, all dangerously believable. Then comes the whispered warning. A servant girl, low-ranked, easily ignored, drops your tray and mutters, "Careful who puts things in your hand when they can't say it to your face." You thank her, because that's what you do when someone warns you indirectly of possible sabotage while pretending to be clumsy. You keep the bracelet on, but you sleep with it tucked under your pillow, just in case. In the harem, a gift is rarely a gesture of affection. It's a test, a leash, a label, or a gentle reminder that your name is being spoken in rooms you haven't entered yet. And sometimes the most dangerous thing you can wear is not a smile, but proof that someone wants to claim you. One morning, just before the call to prayer, you're summoned. Not by a eunuch, not by a servant, but by a letter, sealed in the imperial blue wax, delivered with no explanation, just a glance that suggests everything is about to change. You sit alone as you read it. The script is elegant. The offer is clear. You are to be elevated. Moved to more private quarters, closer to the Sultan, closer to the core of the palace, and further from anonymity. It is on paper a promotion. But here in the harem, a promotion is just a prettier word for exposure. Accept, and you step into the world of real influence. Politics, intrigue, the possibility of bearing a royal child, of becoming a consort, maybe even the Sultan's favourite. It's what some women dream of. It's also where women vanish. You have until sunset to reply. So you walk the gardens, the ones where you used to hide in the shadow of elder concubines. Now they look smaller. The fountains still whisper. The tulips still bloom like delicate secrets. But the air feels different. It's your name they speak now. You think of home, blurry now. You think of the other girls, the ones who never rose, the ones who rose too fast, the ones who were clever, but not clever enough. And you think of yourself. Not the version trained in etiquette and poetry, but the girl who arrived with her old name tucked somewhere between her ribs. That night, you dress carefully. One final choice. You walk past the curtains, the silken borders that separate the known from the unknown, and in the stillness, you answer. Maybe you rise, maybe you vanish, maybe your name is written into palace history, or maybe it's whispered one last time and folded away like a silk scarf in a drawer no one opens anymore. But one thing is certain. You were not just a decoration. You were a strategist in satin, a survivor in perfume, a masterclass in restraint. And for one full day, and maybe longer, you walk the tightrope between power and peril, without falling. Long before comic books and Hollywood blockbusters, the ancient world already had its own Amazons, and they were terrifyingly real. Meet the Scythian women, horse-riding, bow-wielding warriors of the Eurasian steppe who didn't just defy gender norms, they reloaded and galloped right over them. The Scythians were a nomadic people who roamed what is now Ukraine, southern Russia, and parts of Central Asia. Herodotus, the Greek historian, wrote of fierce Amazon women who mated with Scythian men and birthed a tribe of warriors. For centuries, scholars chalked that up to Greek imagination and a little too much wine. But recent archaeology tells a different story, one with bone-deep proof. Excavations of Scythian burial mounds or kurgans have uncovered the remains of women buried with full warrior regalia. Swords, spears, quivers of arrows, and even battle scars. One teenager's skeleton, discovered in the Altai region, had arrowheads embedded in her spine, a grim but undeniable sign that she fought and died in combat. Some were laid to rest with their horses, clad in armour. These weren't ceremonial props, they were used and worn. This was a culture that didn't just allow women to fight, it expected them to. Scythian society, unlike most of its ancient contemporaries, wasn't rigidly patriarchal. While men raided and hunted, women often did the same. Girls were trained from a young age to ride and shoot, and elite females could hold positions of influence. There are even signs that Scythian priestesses held spiritual authority, making them both feared in battle and revered in ritual. The Greeks were both fascinated and horrified. They created the myth of the Amazons, wild warrior women who hated men and lived apart from civilization. But the core of the legend was grounded in their encounters with the Scythians. These women didn't match the submissive domestic ideal of the Greek woman. They were alien, powerful, and therefore mythologized. So next time someone says female warriors are just a fantasy trope, remind them, the Scythians beat us to it by about 2,500 years. And their legacy is written not in legend, but in arrow-pierced skeletons and iron-tipped truths buried beneath the steppe. If you think battlefield leadership was strictly a man's game, then you haven't met the queens of Africa. These weren't pampered palace figures lounging in silk. These were war-hardened rulers who led armies, negotiated treaties, and stared down empires without flinching. And they didn't just participate in warfare, they redefined it. Take Queen Amanirenas of Kush, for example. In the 1st century BCE, the Roman Empire, fresh from annexing Egypt, made the tactical error of trying to extend its grip further south into Nubia. Amanirenas, a one-eyed queen who had already fought in battle, had other plans. She rallied her people, launched a series of counterattacks, and even captured Roman forts. One statue of Augustus? She had it decapitated and buried under her temple steps, a deliciously unsubtle message. Eventually, Rome backed off and negotiated peace. That's right. One of the most powerful empires in history was forced to make nice with a one-eyed warrior queen, and she wasn't alone. Across Africa, female leaders often doubled as military commanders. In the 16th century, Queen Amina of Zazzau, in what is now Nigeria, led cavalry raids across Hausa lands. According to oral tradition, she expanded her territory further than any ruler before or after her. Amina built walls around cities, developed trade routes, and more importantly, never let her gender limit her battlefield authority. Her soldiers respected her not just because she was queen, but because she could probably outfight most of them. Further south, the kingdom of Dahomey was protected by the Agoji, an all-female military regiment the French later nicknamed the Dahomey Amazons. These were not symbolic guards. They were frontline fighters, trained from childhood in weaponry, endurance, and discipline. They served as elite royal protectors and often led charges in battle. Some accounts even describe them as more aggressive than their male counterparts, possibly because they had more to prove, or maybe because they just enjoyed the job. These women weren't rare exceptions. In many African societies, women were expected to be capable, politically, economically, and militarily. They negotiated with colonizers, resisted conquest, and commanded troops. Their existence wasn't radical, it was cultural. So, the next time someone says history was written by men with swords, you might want to add, sure, but some of those swords were held by queens. When you picture ancient Greece or Rome at war, it's usually rows of male soldiers in bronze armor marching off to battle. But stay behind the front lines, and you'll find a different kind of warrior. One who didn't wear a tunic into combat, but picked up a weapon when the city gates were about to fall. Women in both Greek and Roman societies were often forced into defensive roles, and they didn't hesitate to rise to the occasion. In classical Athens, women were officially excluded from military service. Their roles were mostly domestic, religious, or symbolic. But when invaders came knocking, those lines blurred fast. During the Persian Wars, for example, Greek women acted as logistical support, running supplies, caring for the wounded, and in some desperate cases, throwing roof tiles from the city walls onto enemy troops. Not exactly the glamorous side of battle, but it made a difference. The siege of Plataea in 429 BCE offers one striking moment. Women trapped inside the city took up arms, fought alongside the remaining defenders, and, according to Thucydides, played a vital role in the resistance. These weren't trained soldiers. They were citizens turned fighters. But war doesn't always wait for training. Over in Rome, women were technically barred from military engagement. And yet, Roman history is littered with tales of women taking charge when things fell apart. In the sack of Rome by the Gauls in 390 BCE, women reportedly negotiated with the invaders, offered their jewelry to fund defense efforts, and helped rally morale. During later conflicts, like the Second Punic War, Roman women often followed their husbands to military camps, some even acting as informal strategists or advisors. One particularly notable tale comes from the sack of Rome in 410 CE. As Alaric's Visigoths stormed the city, noblewomen like Proba and others are said to have opened their estates as places of refuge, armed their servants, and coordinated resistance within the urban chaos. These weren't passive victims. They were active participants in defence and survival. In the ancient world, warfare wasn't just fought with swords on a battlefield, it was fought with quick thinking, courage, and sometimes sheer desperation, and women were right there in the thick of it, defending their homes when no one else could. If you were a Roman governor in Britannia around 60 CE, your worst nightmare had a name, and it was Boudica. She wasn't just a queen. She was a force of vengeance, fire, and fury, with a knack for rallying an entire population of angry Britons into open revolt against the world's most powerful empire. Boudica ruled the Ursini tribe in eastern Britain. After her husband, King Prasutagus, died, he left his kingdom jointly to his daughters and the Roman Empire, an attempt to secure peace. Rome, being Rome, ignored the will, annexed the territory outright, publicly flogged Boudica, and, in an act so horrific it's still discussed today, had her daughters assaulted. This wasn't just political domination, it was humiliation, and Boudica would not let that stand. What followed wasn't a minor rebellion. It was an all-out war. Boudica became the face of the uprising, leading a coalition of tribes in a scorched earth campaign that shook Roman control to its core. First stop, Camulodunum, modern-day Colchester, a Roman town that was utterly razed. Then Londinium, modern-day London, burned to ash. Verulamium, modern St. Albans, same fate. The Roman historian Cassius Dio described her as tall, terrifying, with a mane of red hair and a fierce presence that stirred her warriors into a frenzy. Tacitus, meanwhile, emphasized her eloquence and leadership, describing how she addressed her troops not as a noblewoman, but as a mother wronged, and a warrior awakened. Though she had early victories, Boudica's army eventually faced a professional Roman force under Governor Suetonius Paulinus. Outnumbered and poorly equipped, the rebels were slaughtered. Boudica either took poison or fell in battle. The sources disagree. But her defeat didn't erase her impact. The Romans learned their lesson. They became more cautious in how they dealt with tribal leaders, and they never forgot the name of the woman who made an empire tremble. Boudica's rebellion wasn't just an uprising. It was a reminder that oppressed people, led by someone with nothing left to lose, can become the most dangerous force of all. And in this case, that force happened to be a mother with a war chariot and a long memory. In the lore of feudal Japan, the image of the samurai is almost always male. A stoic warrior in lacquered armour, loyal to death, sword in hand. But look beyond the cherry blossoms and Bushido scrolls, and you'll find another kind of samurai, one in silk and steel. The Onabu geisha, or women warriors, were not only real, they were deadly. Trained in martial arts, archery and strategy, these noblewomen were the hidden backbone of many samurai clans. They weren't typically sent into open-field battles like their male counterparts, but when their homes, castles or family honour were at stake, they fought without hesitation, and often without mercy. One of the most iconic Onabu geisha was Tomoe Gozen, a 12th century warrior who fought during the Genpei War. Described in the Heike Monogatari, Japan's epic of war and honour, Tomoe was said to be a peerless rider and remarkable archer who could cut down men with one sweep of her katana. She rode into battle like a tempest, wearing full armour, long black hair trailing behind her like a war banner. At the Battle of Owazu, she reportedly decapitated a rival samurai in single combat, a final blaze of glory before disappearing from history like a ghost on horseback. Then there's Nakano Takeiko, a 19th century fighter during the Boshin War. She wasn't formally part of the imperial army, women weren't allowed, so she formed her own unit. an unofficial corps of female warriors who fought with naginata, pole weapons. She died leading a charge against imperial forces, taking a bullet to the chest. Her last request, to be buried with honor by her sister so the enemy wouldn't claim her body. These women weren't tokens or legends. They were part of the martial tradition, upholding the values of Bushido, loyalty, bravery, and self-sacrifice. Some even received the same training as their male counterparts in times of war. Of course, as Japan modernized and centralized its military power, the Onobu geisha were pushed to the margins, their stories reduced to folklore. But the reality remains. In Japan's blood-soaked history of samurai clashes and castle sieges, women's blades were sharpened just as often, and just as deadly. The Roman Colosseum, a monument to cruelty, entertainment, and testosterone-fueled violence. Lions, spears, slaves, and sweaty men locked in mortal combat. But what if we told you that sometimes the combatants weren't just men? That buried beneath the mythos of the Roman gladiator is the lesser-known reality of female gladiators, the gladiatrices. While they were rare, these women did exist, and they weren't there to serve snacks. They fought in front of roaring crowds, trained in the same ludi, gladiator schools, and were often treated with both titillation and terror. Roman emperors, especially the more theatrically inclined, like Nero and Domitian, loved the shock value of women in combat. Female gladiators were novelties, yes, but also formidable warriors in their own right. Evidence is scattered but compelling. A marble relief from Halicarnassus shows two women, Amazon and Achillea, locked in combat. The carving even notes that they fought to a draw, which was considered an honourable outcome. Their names weren't randomly assigned either. They evoked mythic female warriors, framing these women not as weak imitators, but as ferocious equals. Literary sources also mention them. The satirist Juvenal, never one to miss an opportunity to judge, mocked upper-class women who trained as gladiators, suggesting it was a scandalous rejection of femininity. Others, like Suetonius, note that female fighters sometimes appeared in nighttime spectacles, lit by torches and fueled by wine-soaked crowds who weren't exactly there for a thoughtful display of martial skill. But training was real, and the danger wasn't staged. These women fought with swords, tridents, and nets, just like male gladiators, and they bled just as much. They were often slaves, prisoners of war, or criminals sentenced to the arena. Some were volunteers, octoratae, who chose the life of a gladiator for fame, money, or escape from worse fates. In 200 AD, Emperor Septimius Severus banned women from gladiator combat altogether, perhaps worried that Rome's taste for female fighters was becoming a bit too unorthodox, or perhaps because women were proving too good at it. So while they didn't dominate the Colosseum, the gladiatrices carved out a brutal, blood-stained space of their own. In the sand, gender meant little. Skill, ferocity, and survival meant everything. The medieval battlefield wasn't just a boys' club with chainmail. While most women were kept far from formal combat roles, some didn't get the memo, or ignored it on purpose. Whether disguising themselves as men, leading troops as abbesses, or simply refusing to stay in the convent when swords started swinging, medieval women found ways to fight, both literally and symbolically. One of the strangest categories of warrior women, the warrior nuns. During the Crusades, certain religious women did more than pray for victory. They picked up weapons. While most did so defensively, records exist of abbesses and nuns taking command when their convents or lands were threatened. In the 12th century, the abbess of Quedlinburg was a spiritual leader and a military one, commanding vassals in battle as the head of a powerful religious territory. She didn't wear armour, but she sure gave orders like a general. Then there were women who simply became men, at least on paper. Medieval records reveal multiple cases of women disguising themselves in male clothing to enlist in armies. Some were caught and executed, others passed undetected for years. One example is the story of a woman known only as John, who served in an English garrison during the 100 Years' War. When discovered, her comrades reportedly shrugged and let her continue, because she fought just as hard as they did. Joan of Arc, of course, is the superstar of this category, a teenage peasant girl who claimed divine visions, dressed in men's armour, and led the French army to victories that stunned Europe. But for every Joan, there were dozens of unnamed women who didn't have visions or sainthood, just grit and opportunity. Even outside of the battlefield, women played tactical roles. Noble women in besieged castles often coordinated defences, rationed supplies, and negotiated with enemy forces. Eleanor of Aquitaine, while not a sword-swinging warrior, accompanied her husband on crusade and was rumoured to have worn armour, whether as a statement, protection, or performance, is still debated. The point? The Middle Ages weren't nearly as monolithic as they seem. Women found loopholes in rigid systems, snuck past the rules, or simply made up new ones. And while history didn't always record their names, it certainly felt their presence on the battlefield. When people think of the medieval Islamic world, they might imagine flowing robes, caliphs in grand courts, or scholars debating science and philosophy. What they often miss? The women who picked up swords, led armies, and defended cities when men were too slow, too dead, or too distracted by politics. Take Khawla bint al-Azwar, for example, a name that still echoes through Arab folklore like a war cry. A 7th century warrior during the early Muslim conquests, she fought alongside her brother in battle. After he was captured by Byzantine forces, she stormed the enemy lines in black armour, wielding her sword with such precision that soldiers mistook her for Khalid ibn al-Walid, the famed general known as the Sword of Allah. When her identity was revealed, morale didn't drop. It soared. She had earned her place among warriors through sheer skill and nerve. Women like Khawla weren't just battlefield anomalies. In times of crisis, especially during sieges, women took up arms to defend their homes and cities. During the Mongol invasions of the 13th century, as the Khwarezmian Empire crumbled, there are accounts of women fighting in the streets of Nishapur and other cities, flinging stones, wielding daggers, and turning their homes into fortresses. They were never formally trained, but desperation is a powerful teacher. Further west, in Al-Andalus, Islamic Spain, noble women weren't cloistered either. Some wielded considerable political and military influence. Walada bint al-Mustakfi, while best known as a poet, lived in a world where women of her class often ran estates and defended them during civil unrest. A few centuries later, during the Reconquista, Muslim women sometimes joined their husbands in defending the last strongholds of Granada. There's also Sayyida al-Hurra, not a battlefield warrior, but a pirate queen. In the 16th century, she commanded fleets in the western Mediterranean, striking fear into European ships. Allied with the infamous Barbarossa of the Ottoman navy, she was a political leader and naval commander, a double threat on sea and shore. In many Islamic societies, the ideal of modesty coexisted with the reality of necessity. When cities burned and armies failed, the veil came off and the sword came out. And in those moments, history remembered them, not as women who broke the rules, but as warriors who rewrote them. For centuries, history books told us that war was a man's domain. Men led, men fought, men died gloriously, while women waited, wept, or patched wounds in the background. But scratch the surface, and a different story bleeds through. A story of women who didn't wait to be invited to the fight. They crashed the battlefield, often with more guts than glory. From the Scythian horse archers, who likely inspired the Amazon myth, to African queens who outmaneuvered empires, to women gladiators drawing blood in the sand. Every continent has its tales of female warriors. Sometimes they were leaders born into power, like Queen Amina or Boudica. Sometimes they were commoners who stepped up when chaos left no other option, like the medieval cross-dressers or the women defending ancient cities from siege. What unites them isn't just courage, it's the refusal to be erased. The legacy of these women isn't measured by how many battles they won, but by how many rules they broke. They defied cultural norms, religious expectations, and political boundaries. They forced generals, emperors, and chroniclers to revise their assumptions. In many cases, that meant being deliberately written out of the record. After all, what empire wants to admit it was rattled by a woman with a spear? And yet, the traces remain. In bones buried with weapons, in poems, in scratched notes from historians who didn't know what to make of them, in oral traditions, songs, and temple murals. The stories survived, not always intact, not always celebrated, but alive enough to inspire generations that followed. Modern military history has only recently begun to fully acknowledge the breadth of women's contributions to warfare. It's not about placing women above men in battle. It's about recognizing that they were always there, even when they were never supposed to be. So the next time someone calls women in war an exception, remind them. From the deserts of North Africa to the snowy steppes of Central Asia, from castle sieges to chariot charges, women weren't just part of the war story. They were the plot twist, the hidden edge. The blade history tried to sheath but never could, because once a sword is drawn, it doesn't care who's holding it, only what they're willing to do with it. Marcus Aurelius was born on April 26, 121 CE, in Rome, the very heart of an empire that stretched from Britain to the sands of Arabia. His full name, at the time of birth, was Marcus Annius Verus, and he came from a noble lineage with deep senatorial roots. In other words, he wasn't starting from scratch. His grandfather had been a consul, and his family was rich in both wealth and political connections. But young Marcus wasn't spoiled by luxury. Even as a child, he had a reputation for being unusually serious, quiet, and thoughtful. The sort of kid who probably skipped out on the toy swords and asked philosophical questions instead. The Emperor Hadrian took notice of this moody, deep-thinking child and saw in him something rare: integrity. He nicknamed Marcus Verissimus, meaning most truthful, and marked him out for a future few could dream of. When Hadrian's first choice of successor died unexpectedly, he adopted Antoninus Pius under one condition: that Antoninus would, in turn, adopt Marcus Aurelius as his heir. And just like that, Marcus was on a slow-moving, responsibility-laden conveyor belt toward absolute power. His education was nothing short of elite. Tutors drilled him in Greek and Latin literature, rhetoric and philosophy. But while many young aristocrats treated their lessons like chores, Marcus embraced them with religious devotion, especially Stoicism. He read Epictetus and Seneca not as abstract theory, but as a moral compass. To him, philosophy wasn't an intellectual game. It was a manual for how to live. He started sleeping on a hard floor, wore simple clothing, and practiced fasting. Not because anyone told him to, but because he wanted to toughen his soul. As the years passed under the watchful mentorship of Antoninus Pius, Marcus learned not only governance, but patience. Antoninus ruled with calm efficiency for over 2 decades, and Marcus observed every move, every decision, like a student preparing for a final exam he knew would one day come. Unlike many heirs who lust for the crown, Marcus approached power like a duty he would never escape, one that demanded discipline, self-denial, and above all, moral clarity. In short, Rome wasn't getting a playboy prince. It was preparing to crown a philosopher king. When Antoninus Pius died in 161 CE, Marcus Aurelius finally ascended to the throne, but true to form, he didn't seize it with triumphant fanfare. Instead, he immediately insisted that power be shared with Lucius Verus, his adoptive brother. It was a political move drenched in humility, and also in practicality. Rome was too large, too complex, and frankly too on fire to be managed by a single man, even a philosopher. Lucius Verus was Marcus's opposite in almost every way. Where Marcus was stoic and disciplined, Verus loved luxury parties and gladiator games. Marcus studied philosophy by candlelight. Lucius hired chefs and actors. Still, the partnership worked better than expected, mostly because Marcus stayed focused on governance while Lucius led the military. And it's not like Rome was short on military emergencies. Just months into their joint reign, the Parthian Empire, Rome's eastern rival, decided it was time to start some drama. Lucius Verus led the campaign, while Marcus oversaw resources and logistics. The war dragged on for several years but ended in Roman victory. So, win-win, right? Well, not quite. The returning legions brought more than just glory. They carried disease. A mysterious plague, now believed to have been smallpox or measles, swept through the empire. The Antonine Plague would go on to kill an estimated 5 million people, including a large chunk of the Roman military. Cities withered, crops failed, panic spread. And just when things couldn't get worse, they did. Germanic tribes along the Danube frontier saw Rome's weakness and started to push hard against the borders. Rome was being hit from every direction: disease, war, political unrest. Marcus, barely into his rule, was already knee-deep in catastrophe. Lucius Verus died in 169 CE, likely from the plague, leaving Marcus to govern alone, the weight of the world now fully his to carry. Most rulers would have crumbled, but Marcus, calm, meditative, unflinching, saw adversity not as chaos, but as a test, a fire to be endured, not avoided. He didn't whine. He didn't retreat. He turned to his stoic principles and faced Rome's unravelling fabric with quiet resolve. After all, for Marcus, being emperor wasn't about personal glory. It was about duty, no matter how much it hurt. By the early 170s CE, Marcus Aurelius had traded his senatorial toga for a soldier's cloak. The Germanic tribes, especially the Marcomanni, Quadi, and Sarmatians, were pouring across the Danube frontier, emboldened by Rome's recent plague-weakened defences. Marcus didn't delegate this crisis from a marble palace. He rode north, he set up camp, and he stayed there, year after year, leading from the front lines like a general, not a philosopher king. It was in these harsh frontier conditions, surrounded by mud, cold, disease, and constant danger, that Marcus penned one of history's most quietly revolutionary texts, Meditations. He didn't write it for publication, glory, or even his heirs. It was a private journal, a philosophical diary, in which he reminded himself how to remain moral, rational, and composed in a world gone mad. Where other emperors built triumphal arches, Marcus built an inner citadel. In one moment, he was inspecting fortifications or negotiating with tribal leaders. In the next, he was scribbling thoughts like, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." That wasn't campaign strategy. It was soul maintenance. The wars were brutal. The Germanic tribes were not pushovers. They knew the terrain, used guerrilla tactics, and were desperate. Yet Marcus pressed on, adapting Roman military tactics, reorganizing legions, and making hard choices, including granting slaves and non-Romans military roles in exchange for loyalty. Traditionalists grumbled, but Marcus didn't care. He needed bodies, not bloodlines. Despite constant pressure, Marcus refused to become cruel. While his generals urged scorched earth campaigns, he often opted for diplomacy. When cities were taken, he forbade unnecessary slaughter. When tribes surrendered, he offered them land and autonomy, not annihilation. Even on the battlefield, he clung to stoic principles like a man clinging to a raft in a storm. The irony wasn't lost on him. The man who valued tranquility more than glory had become one of Rome's most battle-worn emperors. Yet he bore it all with grim grace. He wasn't fighting for conquest or fame. He was fighting to protect a crumbling empire, and perhaps to test whether philosophy could survive in the mud and blood of real life. Spoiler: it could. While Marcus Aurelius commanded legions and dealt with border invasions, his most enduring legacy wasn't forged with a sword, but with a pen. Amid tents, snow, and the groans of wounded soldiers, Marcus began writing what we now call Meditations, a collection of deeply personal reflections on life, virtue, suffering, and death. He didn't write it to impress anyone. These weren't public declarations or propaganda. They were reminders, to himself. Mental armor. Notes from a man desperately trying to stay humane while presiding over a world unraveling. Waste no more time arguing about what a good man should be. Be one. That's not the voice of an emperor basking in glory. That's someone reminding himself to live with integrity, even when no one's watching. The text reveals a constant inner struggle. Marcus battled not just Germanic tribes, but his own impulses: anger, pride, despair. In one passage, he reminds himself not to expect gratitude. In another, he muses that even emperors are forgotten dust. "Soon you will have forgotten all things," he writes, "and soon all things will have forgotten you." Cheery stuff, unless you're a Stoic. Stoicism, after all, wasn't about joy or control. It was about accepting reality, however brutal, and choosing virtue in every moment. For Marcus, that meant doing his job, showing up, leading justly, not losing his head when plagues and wars spun everything into chaos. He wasn't trying to escape suffering. He was trying to suffer well. Meditations was written in Greek, the intellectual language of the time, and filled with quotes from Epictetus and other Stoic sages. But it's also shockingly modern. Marcus worried about burnout. He advised himself to stay calm around difficult people. He reminded himself that fame is fleeting, pleasure is overrated, and death is natural. It's like the original self-help manual, minus the smiling influencer and affiliate link. What makes meditations remarkable is its humanity. Here was the most powerful man in the known world, sitting by candlelight, trying to be decent, and often doubting he was. He didn't preach perfection. He preached effort. The effort to be just, kind, rational, even when surrounded by disease, war, betrayal, and mortality. And that's why his words still resonate today. Because Marcus didn't just rule Rome, he ruled himself. While Marcus Aurelius was busy managing invasions and maintaining inner peace through philosophy, his personal life was less than tranquil. He married Faustina the Younger, the daughter of Emperor Antoninus Pius, a political union, but one that, at least on paper, seemed affectionate. Together, they had 13 children. 13. But ancient Rome wasn't kind to young lives. Only a handful survived past infancy. Marcus buried 8 of his own children. Just pause and imagine that. A man who daily pondered impermanence in his writings had to live it over and over. While Meditations rarely names these personal losses directly, the tone, somber, resolute, aching, hints at grief barely held at bay. Stoicism didn't eliminate pain. It just gave him tools to bear it. Then there was the drama around Faustina. Roman historians, often more fond of gossip than facts, accused her of everything from infidelity to treason. Cassius Dio and the notoriously salacious Historia Augusta claimed she had affairs with gladiators, soldiers, and possibly plotted against Marcus. But Marcus never publicly condemned her. In fact, he honoured her memory after her death in 175 CE, with temples, coins, and statues. Either he didn't believe the rumours, or he chose forgiveness over scandal. But family tensions didn't end there. One surviving son, Commodus, was being groomed to rule. And let's just say, Commodus was not his father's son in temperament or philosophy. While Marcus was scribbling meditations on humility and restraint, young Commodus was reportedly more interested in extravagant displays, wrestling matches, and self-glorification. Still, Marcus clung to the Roman tradition of hereditary succession. Despite signs that Commodus might be a dangerous choice, Marcus refused to break with custom. He named Commodus co-emperor in 177 CE, a decision that would cast a long, dark shadow over his legacy. At home and abroad, the pressures mounted. Marcus rarely had a moment of peace, if not from external chaos, then from private heartbreak. But he never abandoned his duties. He continued issuing legal reforms, supporting philosophy, and stabilizing an empire beset on all sides by change and decay. Through it all, Marcus Aurelius remained composed, committed, and, above all, human. A ruler who was constantly tested, not just by the sword, but by the weight of love, loss, and legacy. As if plagues, invasions, and family tragedy weren't enough, Marcus Aurelius also had to contend with betrayal, the kind that cuts deepest when it comes from inside the tent. In 175 CE, a respected general named Avidius Cassius declared himself emperor. This wasn't some obscure provincial revolt. Cassius was the governor of Syria and a man Marcus had trusted with immense military authority. And it wasn't entirely his fault either. A false rumour had reached Cassius. Marcus was dead. Rather than verify the facts, Cassius moved fast. He accepted the imperial title, hoping to seize power before the Senate or other legions reacted. It was a classic case of Roman ambition, running faster than Roman news. The East braced for civil war. But Marcus, he didn't panic. He didn't scream betrayal. He simply began preparing for a march east, not for vengeance, but for reconciliation. Incredibly, Marcus even considered pardoning Cassius. He believed in clemency, in preserving unity above pride. His letters and thoughts show a man determined to prevent more bloodshed, even if it meant forgiving a man who tried to steal his crown. It was the ultimate stoic move, keeping calm, not just in chaos, but in the face of personal insult. But Marcus never got the chance to demonstrate that mercy. Before he could reach the east, Cassius was assassinated by his own officers, likely fearful of what the emperor's arrival would mean for them. His head was sent to Marcus as a gift. Marcus reportedly wept. To Marcus, rebellion wasn't just a threat to Rome's authority. It was a tragedy. It symbolized the weakening fabric of imperial loyalty, the creeping instability that would eventually choke the empire. In the wake of the rebellion, Marcus travelled through the eastern provinces, not with rage, but with ritual. He performed public ceremonies, reaffirmed loyalty, and ensured that no one, especially the soldiers, misunderstood his intentions. But the cracks in the empire were widening. The plague had hollowed out the population. The borders were still bleeding. And now even Rome's inner circle had begun to fracture. Marcus saw it all, and still believed in reason, in justice, in virtue. Even as Rome began to unravel at the seams, he tried to stitch it back together, one stoic breath at a time. As Marcus Aurelius approached the end of his life, he wasn't resting on laurels or reclining in a marble villa. He was once again on the frontier, knee-deep in military operations against the Germanic tribes along the Danube. Despite his age and deteriorating health, he returned to the battlefield, because duty didn't retire, and neither did Marcus. The Marcomannic wars had dragged on for years, draining Roman resources and morale. Marcus knew this wasn't just about territory, it was about survival. The Germanic tribes weren't raiding for sport, they were being pushed south by other migrating groups, part of a domino effect that would eventually lead to the fall of Rome centuries later. But in the 170s CE, Marcus was still doing everything he could to hold the line. He reorganized the frontier defenses, resettled refugee tribes as loyal Roman allies, and continued writing philosophical reflections between campaigns. In one eerie passage from Meditations, he reminds himself, "Do not act as if you were going to live 10,000 years. Death hangs over you." These weren't abstract musings. They were the thoughts of a man acutely aware that his end was near. In 180 CE, while stationed in present-day Vienna, Marcus Aurelius fell seriously ill, likely from the same plague that had haunted his reign. According to sources, he summoned his son Commodus to his side and offered him advice. Whether philosophical, practical, or desperate is lost to history. What we do know is that Marcus died shortly after, on March 17th, 180 CE, surrounded not by senators or scribes, but by soldiers. His death marked the end of what many historians call the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. It also marked the end of Rome's age of philosopher kings, Commodus would inherit the throne, and, spoiler alert, he was no Marcus. Rome's decline wouldn't begin with a bang, but with the quiet closing of Marcus's eyes and the slow unravelling of his legacy. There was no triumphal parade, no grand final speech, just a dying emperor in a cold northern outpost, doing what he always did, enduring, reflecting, and fulfilling his role to the very end. Marcus didn't seek immortality through monuments. He sought it through character, and in that he succeeded. Marcus Aurelius had spent his life preaching moderation, discipline, and reason. So naturally, the gods handed him Commodus. When Marcus died in 180 CE, he left the empire in the hands of a 19-year-old who seemed less interested in stoic virtue and more in gladiatorial cosplay. Commodus liked to dress as Hercules, battle in the arena, and refer to himself as the Roman Hercules, because humility clearly skipped a generation. This wasn't just embarrassing, it was catastrophic. Under Commodus, Rome descended into decadence, paranoia, and administrative chaos. He alienated the Senate, indulged in lavish spectacles, and executed rivals on a whim. Where Marcus had treated power as a sacred burden, Commodus treated it like a reality show prize. Bread and circuses became the rule of the day, so the question has haunted historians ever since. Why did Marcus, the wise philosopher, the reflective emperor, leave the empire to such a man? Was it blind love? A misjudgment? Or did Marcus, so bound to tradition and the Roman idea of dynastic continuity, feel he simply had no choice? In truth, Marcus had options. He could have chosen a capable general or senator as his successor. He could have broken with tradition, as Emperor Nerva once had, by adopting a worthy heir. But he didn't. He named Commodus co-emperor in 177 CE, perhaps hoping his son would learn by example. Spoiler: he didn't. It's one of the great ironies of ancient history, that the emperor who wrote Meditations, a work of enduring wisdom on human nature, couldn't or wouldn't prevent his own son from becoming the poster child for imperial failure. And Marcus wasn't blind to his son's flaws. There are hints, even in his writings, of disappointment and warning, about flattery, pride, indulgence, all traits that Commodus embraced with enthusiasm. Still, Marcus never disowned him. Whether out of love, obligation, or exhaustion, he passed the torch, and then watched the fire consume the house. Commodus's rule would end in assassination, and his death would plunge Rome into the year of the 5 emperors. It's a bleak postscript to a reign defined by stoic resilience. Marcus had kept the empire stitched together with wisdom and will. Commodus tore it open with ego and spectacle. And yet, perhaps the ultimate stoic lesson lies here too. Even emperors cannot control the future, only how they meet it. Marcus Aurelius died nearly 2,000 years ago, but his influence has never really left us. He was a rare kind of ruler, not just a man of power, but a man of principle. His Meditations, scribbled during wars and sleepless nights, survived the fall of empires, the rise of religions, and the passage of time to become one of the most treasured philosophical texts in history. His legacy is paradoxical. As an emperor, he faced relentless war, plague, rebellion, and personal loss. Yet he remains admired, not for victories or monuments, but for his mind, his restraint, his compassion, his refusal to be corrupted by absolute power. He didn't style himself as divine. He didn't demand worship. He wrote, in plain Greek, how to be a better human. Do every act of your life as though it were the very last act of your life. Even modern thinkers, from statesmen to CEOs, athletes to psychologists, still quote Marcus Aurelius. His words appear on posters, in therapy sessions, in business guides, and in quiet moments of personal crisis. Why? Because he didn't speak like a king. He spoke like a flawed human trying, desperately, to stay upright in a collapsing world. Yet Marcus's legacy is also bittersweet. Despite his wisdom, his reign marked the beginning of the end for Rome's golden age. His son Commodus accelerated the decline, and future emperors would rarely match his dignity or restraint. It's as if Marcus was the empire's last heartbeat of moral clarity before the fever set in. And perhaps that's the most haunting part of his story, that the man who understood impermanence better than anyone left behind something strangely permanent. His empire crumbled, his bloodline faltered, but his meditations, raw, intimate, unpolished, survived. They survived because they were never meant to. They were never edited, never prepared for an audience, and that's what makes them immortal. They are the private whispers of a public man, the diary of an emperor who wanted nothing more than to live well, die justly, and leave the world no worse than he found it. And in the end, maybe that's all any of us can hope to do. Marcus did it, in sandals, on horseback, with a stylus in hand, one stoic breath at a time. In ancient Babylon, justice wasn't just handed down by kings, it was etched in stone for all to see. Around 1754 BCE, King Hammurabi commissioned a towering stele inscribed with what would become one of the earliest and most influential legal codes in human history, the Code of Hammurabi. Standing over 7 feet tall and written in cuneiform script, the black basalt monument was meant to project both order and authority. It didn't just govern, it warned. The Code of Hammurabi contained 282 laws covering everything from trade and family matters to theft and assault. But it wasn't democratic. These laws reflected a rigidly hierarchical society where penalties varied dramatically depending on your social status. For example, if a nobleman broke the bone of another nobleman, the punishment was to have his own bone broken, a clear case of the infamous eye for an eye approach. But if the same nobleman broke the bone of a commoner or a slave, the punishment was merely a fine. Justice in this system was proportional not only to the crime, but to the rank of the person involved. The laws emphasized personal responsibility and state authority. Builders whose poorly constructed homes collapsed and killed the inhabitants could be put to death. Merchants who cheated customers could face mutilation. Even family disputes were tightly regulated, with strict laws governing marriage, inheritance, and parental authority. Adultery, theft, and false accusation were especially harshly punished, often by execution or public shaming. What made the code revolutionary was not just its content, but its visibility. It stood in public spaces, carved with the image of Hammurabi receiving divine authority from Shamash, the sun god and god of justice. This wasn't just a legal document, it was propaganda, reinforcing the idea that Hammurabi ruled by divine right and that his laws were sacred and immutable. However brutal it may seem by modern standards, the Code of Hammurabi established the concept that law should be written, standardized, and accessible. It replaced arbitrary judgment with codified norms. In doing so, it laid the groundwork for later legal systems across the ancient world and continues to fascinate historians, lawyers, and ethicists alike. In Babylon, justice wasn't blind. It was watching, and it had a chisel. In ancient Egypt, justice wasn't just a legal concept, it was a cosmic force. The Egyptians believed in Ma'at, a divine principle embodying truth, balance, and moral order. More than just a goddess, Ma'at represented the foundation of the universe itself. Pharaohs ruled not just with power, but with the responsibility to uphold Ma'at. In doing so, they maintained harmony between gods, nature, and society. Unlike the codified laws of Babylon, Egyptian justice was more flexible and case-specific. There was no singular legal code chiseled into stone. Instead, judges, often high officials or priests, interpreted Ma'at in their rulings. While this allowed for context-sensitive decisions, it also meant that justice could be highly subjective and dependent on the social standing of those involved. Court proceedings were both formal and performative. Cases could be tried before local officials or higher courts in the royal bureaucracy, depending on the severity. Plaintiffs and defendants presented their versions of events, and witnesses were essential. Written records, contracts, testimonies, and petitions were maintained on papyrus, a relatively advanced system of documentation for its time. For common offences like theft or assault, punishments could include fines, beatings, or forced labour. More serious crimes, such as tomb robbery or blasphemy, were treated as offences not only against the state, but against the gods. These could lead to execution, sometimes by fire, drowning, or impalement, or even posthumous punishment, like desecration of the corpse to prevent entry into the afterlife. Perhaps the most iconic image of Egyptian justice comes from the Book of the Dead, in which the heart of the deceased is weighed against the feather of Ma'at. If the heart was heavy with wrongdoing, it was devoured by Amit, a crocodile-lion-hippopotamus monster, and the soul was condemned to oblivion. If it balanced with the feather, the soul was allowed to enter the eternal paradise of the field of reeds. In Egypt, justice was inseparable from spirituality. The courtroom was not just a venue for dispute, it was a sacred space where divine order was upheld. Unlike Babylon's rigid laws, Egyptian justice flowed with the moral tides of Ma'at, rewarding those who lived in harmony with truth and punishing those who disrupted the balance of the cosmos. In ancient Greece, particularly in Athens during the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, justice took on a radically different form from the divine or king-centered systems of Babylon and Egypt. The Greeks began experimenting with something revolutionary, a justice system grounded in citizenship, debate, and public participation. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but it laid the foundation for many modern legal concepts. Athenian democracy gave every male citizen the right to participate in the courts, both as a plaintiff or defendant and as a juror. There were no professional judges or lawyers. Instead, massive juries, sometimes hundreds strong, were randomly selected from the population. These jurors were responsible not only for hearing cases, but for deciding verdicts and penalties, all without appeal. Trials were short, often completed in a single day, and each side was allowed a set amount of time to present their case, measured by a water clock called a clepsydra. The types of cases ranged widely. Theft, slander, adultery, assault, property disputes, and even impiety, disrespecting the gods, could be brought to trial. While punishments for minor offences were often fines or exile, more severe crimes could lead to death, particularly in cases involving treason or religious sacrilege. Socrates, for example, was famously sentenced to death for allegedly corrupting the youth and disrespecting the gods. Importantly, Greek justice systems did not rely on a written legal code accessible to all. While some laws were inscribed publicly, much of the legal knowledge was held by a small literate elite, meaning outcomes often depended more on rhetoric than on precedent. A clever speaker, or a rich citizen who could hire a skilled orator to speak for them, had a clear advantage. Justice was tied closely to persuasion and performance. Athenians also used a form of preemptive justice called ostracism, in which citizens could vote once a year to exile someone from the city for 10 years. No crime had to be proven, just a consensus that someone had become too dangerous or powerful for the health of the state. Though flawed, ancient Greece introduced the idea that justice could be a collective civic responsibility, not just the decree of a ruler or priest. It was an early and chaotic experiment in legal equality that still echoes in today's courtrooms. In ancient India, justice was rooted in a profound and layered concept called dharma, a term that defies easy translation but roughly means duty, righteousness, and cosmic law. Unlike the law codes of Babylon or the civic trials of Greece, Indian justice was not just about right and wrong, it was about maintaining harmony in the universe, society, and the self. Dharma varied depending on one's age, caste, gender, and stage of life, making justice a deeply contextual and moral affair. The legal framework in ancient India was first formalized in texts known as the Dharma Shastras, with the most well-known being the Manusmriti, or Laws of Manu, compiled around the 2nd century BCE to the 3rd century CE. These texts weren't laws in the modern sense, but spiritual and social guidelines that shaped legal thinking for centuries. They defined everything from property rights and inheritance to marriage, contracts and punishments. The caste system was central to this legal vision. Brahmins, priests, kshatriyas, warriors, vaishyas, merchants, and shudras, labourers, were each subject to different rules and penalties. For instance, a Brahmin committing a certain offence might face a fine or temporary exclusion from rituals, while a Shudra committing the same act could be sentenced to corporal punishment or worse. Justice in this system was not blind. It was hierarchical, deeply tied to one's birth. Despite this, Indian justice was not entirely unforgiving. The concept of intent mattered, as did repentance. A wrongdoer could lessen punishment through penance or charity, and judges were encouraged to consider the moral and spiritual state of the accused. Kings often served as the highest judicial authority, advised by Brahmin scholars and ministers, blending divine law with royal decree. Trials could involve ordeals, especially when evidence was inconclusive. These included holding red-hot iron, walking through fire, or retrieving objects from boiling oil, believed to reveal guilt or innocence based on divine will. Such methods were seen as a last resort, not standard practice. Above all, justice in ancient India aimed to restore cosmic balance. It wasn't just about punishing crime, it was about righting spiritual wrongs, correcting social disorder, and guiding souls back toward Dharma. It was a justice system where morality, religion, and law were inseparable. Across the ancient world, when legal systems hit a wall, when evidence was lacking, witnesses unreliable, or accusations unprovable, societies often turned to the gods to decide. One of the most dramatic and terrifying ways this happened was through trial by ordeal, a practice used in multiple cultures, including Babylon, India, and later medieval Europe. The idea was simple but brutal. If human justice couldn't determine guilt, divine justice would intervene through pain. In Babylon, one common ordeal involved throwing the accused into a river. If they floated or survived, the gods had spared them, and they were declared innocent. If they drowned, guilt was confirmed, though inconveniently, the dead could no longer be punished. This method reflected a deep belief in divine oversight, as water was seen as a sacred and impartial force. In ancient India, as outlined in the Dharma Shastras, multiple forms of ordeal existed. These included walking across hot iron ploughshares, retrieving coins from boiling oil, or surviving exposure to venom. The logic wasn't cruelty, it was divine arbitration. Surviving unharmed or with minimal injury was interpreted as proof of innocence. The gods, it was believed, would not allow the innocent to suffer without cause. Though horrific by modern standards, trial by ordeal wasn't always purely physical. In some cases, it involved oaths taken in sacred spaces. Swearing on a holy object or invoking a deity's wrath was thought to bind the speaker to truth. Lying under such conditions was believed to invite divine punishment, either immediately or in the afterlife. The psychological power of ordeal was immense. It could terrify the guilty into confession and bolster the faithful's belief in cosmic justice. But it also revealed how fragile human legal systems were, how deeply ancient peoples felt the need for something beyond human judgment. Ordeals were usually a last resort, a way to settle cases no one could otherwise resolve. Despite their reliance on supernatural outcomes, ordeals reflected a desire for fairness. They were brutal, yes, but they were also democratic in a strange way. Kings and peasants alike could be subjected to them. In the absence of forensics or due process, suffering became a courtroom, and the gods were expected to serve as judge, jury, and executioner. In ancient Egypt, justice was not administered by impartial courts or elected juries. It flowed directly from the divine authority of the pharaoh. As both king and living god, the pharaoh was seen as the earthly embodiment of Ma'at, the principle of truth, balance, and cosmic order. This meant that maintaining justice wasn't just a political duty, it was a sacred obligation. The pharaoh had ultimate legal authority. His word could overrule any judgment, command the execution of criminals, pardon the guilty, or rewrite laws at will. This concentration of power was justified not through human logic, but through divine sanction. To disobey the pharaoh was to disrupt the harmony of the universe. But the pharaoh didn't govern alone. A vast bureaucratic system extended across Egypt, from royal officials in the capital to local magistrates in provincial towns. These officials acted as judges, scribes, and investigators. Their decisions were guided by royal edicts and the principles of Ma'at, rather than a formal legal code. Written laws were rare and largely case-based, passed down through precedent and scribal training. Courtrooms varied in size and importance. In local villages, disputes might be handled by a council of elders or temple priests. In major cities, formal judgment halls heard complex cases involving property, theft, assault, and inheritance. Proceedings were recorded in meticulous detail on papyrus scrolls, many of which survive today, giving us a rare window into how ancient Egyptians argued and judged. Trials included elements of both testimony and written evidence. Plaintiffs and defendants gave their accounts, often under oath. Witnesses were called, and physical evidence, when available, was considered. False accusations were taken seriously, and if proven, could result in the accuser receiving the punishment intended for the defendant. Punishments varied widely, from restitution and fines to flogging, forced labour, or execution. Crimes against temples, tombs, or royal property were treated with special severity. Yet, the system also emphasised rehabilitation and compensation. In many cases, wrongdoers were given opportunities to make amends, particularly if they confessed voluntarily. What made Egyptian justice unique was its fusion of absolute monarchy and moral expectation. The pharaoh may have ruled with unchecked power, but he was expected to wield it with fairness. In the eyes of his people and his gods, a just ruler wasn't merely feared. He was revered as the guardian of cosmic balance. While divine kings and priestly classes dominated justice in many ancient civilizations, ancient Greece, particularly democratic Athens, took a dramatically different approach. Justice was no longer the exclusive domain of gods and monarchs. It became a public duty, shared and enacted by citizens through councils and popular assemblies. In Athens, the administration of justice rested primarily with two major institutions: the Ecclesia, the citizen assembly, and the Heliaia, a massive popular court composed of citizen jurors. Rather than being handed down from rulers, law and justice were shaped by everyday male citizens who took turns participating in governance. Laws were proposed and voted on by the assembly, while trials were conducted by large juries, sometimes numbering 500 or more, to prevent bribery or manipulation. There were no judges in the modern sense. Instead, magistrates, selected by lottery or popular vote, organised trials and ensured procedures were followed. However, it was the jurors, drawn randomly from citizens over the age of 30, who decided the verdict. With no appeal process and no deliberation room, verdicts were final, and penalties were voted on directly after guilt was determined. This system favoured persuasive speech over evidence. Defendants and plaintiffs had to represent themselves or hire skilled orators to write speeches on their behalf. Rhetoric was everything, and clever manipulation of public emotions could sway the outcome. While this system promoted civic participation, it also meant that justice could be uneven, less about law and more about persuasion. For certain political matters or threats to the state, special assemblies or councils were convened. One famous mechanism was ostracism, where citizens voted once a year to exile anyone deemed dangerous to democracy. No crime had to be committed, just a public consensus that someone's influence was unhealthy. 10 years in exile, no trial, no defence. Despite its imperfections, the Greek council-based system introduced powerful new ideas. The importance of peer judgment, open debate, and the notion that law belongs to the people. It was messy, emotional, and sometimes unjust, but it was also revolutionary. In Greek justice, the courtroom was a stage, the the citizen was the judge, and justice was a public performance, one in which every man had a part to play, and where power was held briefly in the hands of the people themselves. In ancient India, justice extended far beyond courtrooms and punishments. It was interwoven with the concept of karma, the belief that every action carries moral weight and spiritual consequence, both in this life and in the next. Unlike the civic trials of Greece or the royal decrees of Egypt, Indian justice emphasized a cosmic ledger, where no wrongdoing escaped ultimate accountability. Karma wasn't a legal mechanism, it was a moral law embedded in Hindu, Jain and Buddhist traditions. Good actions led to positive outcomes, while bad actions brought suffering, even if not immediately. A thief might evade human justice, but the universe itself would balance the scales. This belief reinforced ethical behavior, even in the absence of enforcement. Still, ancient India did have structured legal systems. The Manusmriti and other Dharma-shastras offered guidance not just for courts, but for individual conduct. They outlined specific duties for each caste and role in society, reinforcing that justice was not a one-size-fits-all model. Kings were expected to rule according to Dharma, and failing to do so could bring spiritual as well as political consequences. Buddhism, which emerged in the 5th century BCE, further deepened the karmic view of justice. It rejected caste-based legal inequality and promoted universal moral principles, non-violence, truthfulness, and compassion. While not a legal code, Buddhist ethics influenced rulers like Emperor Ashoka, who in the 3rd century BCE renounced conquest and reformed his empire around Buddhist values. His famous rock edicts speak of mercy, tolerance, and the moral responsibility of governance. Justice, then, was about much more than trial and punishment. It was about inner purity, intention, and spiritual accountability. A person might escape a king's penalty, but not the consequences of their own deeds. Likewise, a king who ruled unjustly was believed to be storing up suffering for himself in future lives. This karmic understanding of justice created a powerful internalized system of order. It was deeply personal, and for many, far more intimidating than any earthly authority. Whether enforced by law or left to the cosmos, Indian civilization viewed justice not merely as retribution, but as a force for restoring harmony between self, society, and the universe itself. Though thousands of years have passed since the rise of Babylon, Egypt, Greece, and India, their justice systems continue to shape how we think about crime, punishment, and fairness today. These ancient civilizations laid the intellectual, moral, and procedural foundations of legal systems that still guide societies across the globe. Babylon gave us the earliest known codified law, the idea that justice should be publicly visible, consistent, and enforced by the state. The principle of an eye for an eye still appears in legal and ethical debates, symbolizing both the call for proportionate punishment and the dangers of retributive excess. Egypt introduced the concept of divine kingship and moral law, where justice was not just social, but cosmic. The emphasis on balance, truth and harmony echoes in modern ideas of restorative justice, where the goal isn't just to punish, but to restore community equilibrium. Greece revolutionized justice by tying it to citizenship and participation. Trial by jury, public debate, and the notion of peer judgment began in Athens and remain central to many legal systems today. Though imperfect and exclusionary, Greek democracy planted the seeds for legal systems that value public involvement and accountability. India contributed deeply spiritual and ethical dimensions to justice. The concepts of dharma and karma added a moral backbone to legal systems, encouraging personal responsibility and self-regulation. Even today, Indian law reflects a hybrid system where British legal structures coexist with religious and customary laws, demonstrating the enduring power of ancient traditions. These systems weren't flawless. They were often unjust, classist, patriarchal, and brutal. They privileged the elite, punished the vulnerable, and enforced hierarchies. But they also posed essential questions still relevant today. Who gets to define justice? Is it grounded in divine authority, civic consensus, or moral truth? Should law be equal for all, or adjusted for social role? How do we balance punishment with mercy? Modern law may be more humane and structured, but it carries the DNA of these early systems. We still carve laws into stone, figuratively, expecting them to uphold order. We still debate justice in courts, assemblies, and temples of thought. And we still wrestle with the same eternal tension between power and fairness, law and morality, crime and consequence. In many ways, our pursuit of justice is ancient and ongoing.